computers, a Mac and a PC. They look different from the outside, but open them up. Their motherboards look kind of the same. But the size of the parts, the wiring, and the speed of processing can differ, even though essentially the functions are the same. And so it is with sex differences in the brain. We look different from the outside, but open us up our motherboards, our brains, they look really similar. But the size of some of the parts, the wiring, and the speed of processing can differ, even though essentially the functions are the same. So yes, there are biologic differences in the male and female brain. Now, this may seem surprising coming from someone like me. I'm a 60s child, product of feminism. We were not allowed to talk about sex differences in the brain because, as some of you may know, this led to oversimplified misinterpretations and evoked biases and got some people into some hot water. But I come from a medical family, and I've always been interested in the brain, what makes us tick and why. I can remember back in middle school, we talked a lot about differences between boys and girls. And I can remember thinking about differences in how we expressed our feelings when we were sad or angry or anxious or aggressive. Then in high school, we discussed differences between boys and girls as issues of power and authority in relationships and conditions at work. I'm a 60s child, remember? But then, after college, as a research assistant, I was studying the closing of psychiatric hospitals. And I noticed there were more young men than women with a form of psychosis called schizophrenia. And I have been studying sex differences in psychiatric disorders since then. That is, how our biologies, our brains, our physiologies, how they affect these illnesses differently. And I've come to know that it is the small sex differences in the brain, and they are small. There's lots of individual variability. In fact, more variability within sex than there is between the sexes. But these small sex differences in the brain provide really important clues as to why we see substantial sex differences across a number of psychiatric disorders in their onset, their frequency, their expression, their course of prognosis, even how we respond to treatments, and how and why they occur so frequently with general medical illnesses. And disorders of the heart and brain are two prime examples of this. Major depression and heart disease are the number 1 and 2 primary causes of disability worldwide. And women are at almost twice the risk of major depression than men. And heart disease, well, that's always been considered a man's disease, but actually, it's the number 1 killer from disease of women in the United States and in most middle-income countries. And major depression and heart disease, they occur really frequently together, over 20% of the population. And that co-occurrence called comorbidity, that will be the number 1 cause of disability worldwide by 2020. And women have twice the risk of that compared to men. And people with major depression who also have heart disease, they have a 3 to 5-fold risk of death from heart disease. And finally, major depression and heart disease are independent risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, memory decline. And we know there's a much higher frequency of Alzheimer's disease in women than men. And we're now coming to know it's not only because women live longer. So disorders of the heart and brain, these are some of the primary public health challenges of our time. And if left untreated, they will tank our or our children's economy. And we believe that applying a sex difference lens to this will enhance our ability to tackle these problems, because we believe that the causes of these sex differences across these disorders are in part shared. So let's begin with asking the question, how do sex differences in the brain relate to sex differences in the co-occurrence or comorbidity of major depression and cardiovascular disease, heart disease? Well, the answer to this question lies in our understanding of how the brain talks to the heart, how it does so differently in men and women, and the story begins in fetal development. Now, sex differences in major depression, they do not occur until post-puberty, early adulthood, and sex differences in heart disease, well, they don't occur until much later in life. But the origins, the roots to these, begin in fetal development. We have been studying this through our investigations of the brain circuitry, brain regions, that regulate how we respond to stress. Stress affects every chronic disease we know, and major depression and heart disease are no exception to that. The circuitry, the brain circuitry, that regulates how we respond to stress consists of some of the most highly so-called sexually dimorphic brain regions in the brain. That is, they develop differently in the male and female brain, and they function differently across the lifespan. Now, the key relay station that regulates how we respond to stress is a little set of nerve cells that sit on top of the brainstem, called the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, or PVN for short. Now, this PVN is a really powerful little set of nerve cells. I've become obsessed with it. It not only regulates how we respond to stress, it regulates our mood and anxiety in response to stress. It regulates our physiology in response to stress, hormonal responses, immune responses. It even regulates blood pressure and cardiac tone, our fight-flight response to stress, and then our ability to calm that fight-flight response. And it regulates cardiac tone through this amazing nerve called the vagus nerve. Now, the vagus nerve runs from a small set of nerve cells in the brainstem, nuclei in the brainstem, directly down to the heart. And that same set of nerve cells connects directly to our friend, the PVN. And in this way, the brain, the central nervous system, talks directly to the heart, at least electrically so. Now, what we have found is that the PVN and even the blood vessels that surround the PVN and some of the other stress circuitry regions, they develop differently in the male and female brain in fetal development. And sex differences in the development of these regions, we have found, are significantly associated with how we regulate stress in the brain across our lives. And that is the healthy physiology of the brain. Now let's just take a moment and let's reimagine the Mac and the PC. And let's picture they are in two manufacturing plants and they're being constructed. And let's imagine a flood occurs. The damage to the motherboards of these two computers will differ depending on where the manufacturers are at in the construction of these two computers. So the timing of the flood is really important. What does this have to do with sex differences in the brain? Like, where is she going? Well, what we have found is that prenatal disruptions, that is, adverse events, exposures, obstetric complications, that lead to an excessive hormonal or immune response in the mother, a so-called prenatal stress response, will have differential consequences for the development of the offspring brain, depending on the timing of the exposure, like the flood, and whether the offspring is male or female. And what we have found is that females, depending on the timing of the exposure, will experience more adverse consequences to the development of the PVN, the blood vessels that surround the PVN, and some of the other stress circuitry regions, more so than the male fetal brain. And that's with regard to how these nerve cells grow, how they connect with each other, even how they die. And those adverse consequences, more so in the female brain, are significantly associated with a higher risk in females in midlife for major depression and its comorbidity with loss of cardiac tone through the vagus nerve. And we know that loss of cardiac tone is a significant predictor of cardiovascular disease itself. So what we have shown is that sex differences in the development of the brain will have important insights into understanding sex differences in the comorbidity of major depression and cardiovascular disease. So what? So what can we do about this? Well, first, let me underscore, pregnancy does not determine our child's life trajectory, right? There's lots of individual variability after birth, of course. But taking a lifespan perspective starting in fetal development for thinking about chronic diseases that don't occur until much later in life, this is a very optimistic, a promising approach for thinking about the development of therapeutics. Because if we can identify the early risks and, frankly, early resiliences, we can target our treatments early in order to attenuate disability later in life, and ultimately, we hope, prevent these illnesses altogether. And we believe that applying a sex difference lens to this will enhance our ability to develop more efficacious treatments, what we are calling sex-dependent therapeutics. And our team has embarked on this endeavor for disorders of the heart and brain. Sex differences in medicine have not been given their due, in part because of biases. Biases against women, as I've learned from feminism, but biases by some feminists to ignore the biology of sex. So to the young generation going into science and medicine, be ever so vigilant in observation, because observation is the key to novel science. And in that way, we can all contribute to science. But be skeptical of dogma, particularly when it fits your own biases. And I have learned that lesson. And to the young generation going into medicine, sex matters. Thank you.